Hello, I'm at Doc Nicola, hashtag futurologist, hashtag waistcoat. Oh, hang on, I'm in the real world. Hello, I'm Nicola, and I'm a futurologist, and I have a rather sad obsession. I'm going to confess tonight that I am slightly obsessed by ticket machines. Now, this obsession started a while back, and I started to watch people in railway stations using ticket machines, or not, as the case may be, and then people in airports using ticket machines, actually more likely to be using ticket machines. And I started to think, well, gosh, this is really weird. Why are people using these things or not using these things? Why do we choose to use some technologies and not others? Why do we choose some channels to interact with organizations sometimes, and then other times? And being a psychologist, I'm kind of thinking, ooh, this is rather interesting. So I started to study people using ticket machines. So I hung around a lot of railway stations, I hung around a lot of airports, I tried not to get arrested. And whilst doing that, I kind of started to form some theories as to why do we use the technologies that we use. And actually, after a few years of being incredibly geeky about this, it boiled down to, well, three things, really, that we need to think about. Maybe if we're designing technologies or introducing technologies or doing strategy around technologies. And I like to boil it down to, I call it the 3 U's. So the first thing we need to think about is the technology actually useful in the first place? The second thing we need to think about is the technology usable? And then the third, and probably the most interesting one, is it being used? So let's take each of these in turn. So as I was watching ticket machines being used, one of the obvious questions is, well, are they useful? I'm a customer. Generally, customers are very goal-oriented. So in terms of getting tickets, well, actually, my ultimate aim is probably to get somewhere, whether that be on the train or on a plane. And actually, getting a ticket is an incidental thing, but rather critical unless you want to end up in prison. So one thing I like to think about ticket machines is, well, they are useful. They will give me a ticket. And yet, when I compared something like a train station with an airport, what I typically find is, and go into my local station on a Monday morning, generally what will happen is there's a queue out of the door for the human ticket sellers, and there are a few rather lonely self-service machines lurking somewhere in a corner, unloved, often with cobwebs all over them. No one's using them. And yet, when we go to an airport, well, actually, they've engineered it now that it's actually quite difficult for me to get anywhere without using some form of self-service. But even the evolution of these things is interesting, because useful, right, it's going to give me a ticket. Now, the first thing, you never, ever ask the designers of these machines whether they're useful, by the way, because, of course, they will say, yes, they are. And if you go, no, they're not, it's kind of the design equivalent of calling their baby ugly. So useful is in the eye of the beholder, largely. Now, let's compare ticket machines. So in train stations, typically what we've experienced in the past with these machines is often when they first introduced them, they weren't very good. Often they didn't take credit cards, sometimes they didn't work at all, and they're still maybe not the most reliable things on earth. And yet they do give us tickets. So what's going on? What's going on? What happened that we don't use them sometimes? Well, because of past experience with these machines, we're a little bit cynical. So we think the human bit is much more reliable, so we're going to stand in a queue. Interestingly, sometimes we need to be persuaded that these machines are useful. Now, I compare this with airports, and I remember standing in an airport maybe 10 years ago. I was standing in a queue for the humans, and there were these new things standing in the corner. And I got picked out of the queue by somebody who said, hey, How do you fancy being a duty-free way before everybody else? And I'm kind of, yes, please, please do that. So they picked me out of the queue and they showed me the ticket machine and they showed me how to check in, choose my seat and get a ticket. I was convinced. And now I love these machines so much I've been known to check whole plane loads of people in because I love them. Compare this with train stations. So generally what happens is we're all in a queue. In fact, this happened to me last week. So rather than directing people over to the perfectly useful ticket machines, what they tend to do, certainly at my local railway station, is to send someone down the queue with a ticket machine selling tickets. Now, in terms of behaviour change, you can kind of see why airports have changed quite a lot in terms of self-service machines, and train stations maybe haven't so much, because airports have taught us very heavily that these machines are actually useful, whereas railway stations, they are useful, but we're not necessarily using them. So that's useful. The next thing, usable. Now, I could spend hours talking about usability. It's a very well-known science. It's all about good design. It's all about reducing effort. It's all about intuitive. It's all about reducing complexity. Now, the interesting thing, again, if we go back to my geekiness, ask about tickets and ticket machines. Now, I remember, again, about 15 years ago, probably, talking to the airlines, and they were going, no, we will never be able to sell tickets through self-service because our tickets are too complex. So what did they do? Well, actually, they reduced the complexity of their ticketing. They introduced these wonderful algorithms that do a lot of calculation for us. We don't really need to think about it. We can buy the tickets. In fact, they can fill a plane probably within 3 minutes now because they've simplified the ticketing structures. Now, trains. Railways have simplified their ticketing, but the number of times I do see people standing by those self-service machines going, okay, is it a super off-peak? Is it a super off-peak? Is it off-peak? Is it on-peak? I have no idea what peak is. Confusion. Hence, again, people are not necessarily certain. They don't necessarily serve themselves because there is a compromise in the usability. There is also one really interesting bit of usability that we often maybe underestimate. And that's actually joy of use, enjoyment, pleasure. There's actually a whole field called pleasurenomics. I actually changed my job title for a while to pleasurenomics consultant, just to see what people said. People got the wrong idea, frankly. But one of the things around pleasurenomics is simply about beautiful design. Now think of your iPhone. What do you do with your iPhone? You stroke it. It's lovely. But you're actually interacting it in a way that almost it makes it lovely for us to use. So maybe we don't just need to think about usability in terms of, well, we do need to reduce complexity. We need to make it intuitive. But actually sometimes for people to use something, actually enjoying using it is quite critical and key. And we often forget that in usability. So, we've got useful, gets us to our goal. We've got usable, it's easy to use and intuitive. Now, Kevin Costner once said, if you build it, they will come. So if you get useful and usable, yes, people are going to use it, aren't they? I have to say, Kevin Costner was wrong, because there are an awful lot of technologies out there that are both useful and are usable, like ticket machines in railway stations, that are still not used. Now, the interesting thing is, I think used is the most fascinating piece, because the psychology behind why people do stuff is really quite fascinating. So, why do we use technologies? Well, partially it's context. Have we got access to them? Do we feel confident using them? Certainly that is a very, very big factor. However, there are a number of other things going on. Well, the first thing, the lovely psychology, quite evil psychology behind this, is around things like nudge effects. So actually, we're probably more likely to use technologies if we know someone that's kind of similar to us that's using it. Facebook's a really, really good example of this. A social network of one, frankly, is quite a lousy social network. So we're probably more likely to adopt something like Facebook if we know someone else on Facebook. But this doesn't just work on a social network. It also works in everyday life. So we know at the moment over 70s are adopting technologies faster than any other sector or demographic. Why? Because people are buying things like Kindles and iPads, and these are really useful, they're very usable, and yet suddenly they're going, oh, my friend's using it. Ooh, maybe I should look at this. At work, and I've done a lot of work around adoption at work, of work technologies as well, we're probably more likely to adopt a technology at work if our peers are adopting it, our colleagues are adopting it, our bosses are adopting it and promoting it, because people like us are starting to use it. So that's a factor very much in terms of how do we actually persuade people to use this stuff, get other people to use it, and get other people to encourage others to use the technology. However, it's not as easy as that. As I said, context is sometimes king, because the other factor that we find in terms of the used piece is really around what mode am I in? What goal am I in? What motivational drive have I got to use these channels? So we did a lot of interviews around, we're not single channel customers, we don't always use the internet, we sometimes go into a physical shop, we sometimes ring up a call center. We move around a lot. Why? What's going on? So to get under this, we did a lot of interviews. We asked people, why do you use one channel sometimes and another channel other times? And in actual fact, what we found was the motivational goal of the customer was also a very big factor as to whether the technology was used or not. And typically what we find with customers is that they are in one of three modes. So the first mode we like to call visionary. The second one is utilitarian, and the third one is customer in crisis. These are all different modes, all different motivations, all different goals. And our tolerance of different channels and self-service are different depending on which mode we are in. So if we are a visionary, we are generally very positive. We want to go on holiday. We want to go on a trip. We have a job interview. So actually, in terms of finding out how to get there, we'll do our homework. We're very positively motivated. We will use any technology that will get us there. However, because generally visionaries are very enthusiastic, the goal means a lot to them, we are also sometimes incredibly paranoid. Will this actually get to my goal? Will I actually get my ticket on time in order to get the train? All of those things drive us to use different technologies and different channels. And that's often why at Christmas, rather than necessarily buy online, particularly as we get to the week before Christmas, probably paranoia will force us into the retail stores, which is why it's always very busy, because we don't know if we're going to get our goods. We're paranoid. We have a goal. We're a visionary customer. The good thing about visionary customers is typically they will use any channel that gets them to their goal. So if you're looking at moving people onto self-service, actually get them to use those ticket machines, they will do if they are convinced. And that's where that education process comes in. Teach people that it is useful, it is usable, and it is used. However, we may start as visionaries sometimes, but we often slip into another mode that I like to call customer in crisis. We have all been there. We have a goal. We can't get to it. That is the point where we get angry. We get frustrated. Now, interestingly enough, our brain, the chemistry of our brain starts to change when we get angry and frustrated. So the first thing that goes is my short-term memory capacity. If we put self-service in front of a customer that's angry or frustrated, we've all been there. The train is pulling in. What ticket do I want? Oh my God, it's going wrong. That's probably because we're not thinking straight. So these customers are not good customers for self-service. They will often want to go to a human channel. Often they want to offload to that channel. They want to basically get to their goal. They don't want technology in the way. If you do put technology in front of these people, it has to be really simple. Because if you do something like very complex. Press 1 for this, press 2 for that. By the time I get to 2, I won't remember what 1 was for. So again, we have to reduce the complexity of design if we want an angry and frustrated customer, a customer in crisis, to use a self-service channel. But of course, we're not always in 2 states of apoplexy. We're not always really, really positive or really, really negative. There is a middle ground. I call it utilitarian. And they're customers that just want to get there fast. Buying groceries, paying bills, getting a ticket, frankly, is a utilitarian task. I don't want a song, I don't want to dance, I want to do it quickly, I want to do it simply, I want to get on my way. And actually, if you can do really good design of things like ticket machines, things like self-service channels, those kind of customers love it because it saves them time and it saves them energy. So, if you're designing technologies, using innovation to introduce new technologies into a workplace, think of the 3 U's. Is it useful? Is it usable? And then finally, is it used? And which modes are your customers actually in when those technologies are introduced? So good luck on your journey to introduce technology and innovation into your workplace. Thank you for listening.